in first. Plenty of time for questions at the end. I imagine some of this will be familiar to some people. Some will be very bizarre to other people. So what I'd like to do is go through the material and just set aside a bunch of time for questions, and we can dig in there. I think that will actually be the most organic way, the most alive way that we can cover this material. So hopefully you can now see a Google Doc. Again, as I mentioned, I have no way to see your faces as we go through this, I think. If you have questions as we go through it, I can see the question window. So I'm going to try and keep this as engaging as I can without any actual social feedback. It's going to be a bizarre situation. But of course, what we're exploring today is the idea of trauma. And in particular, what I'd like to work with is the idea that nobody actually has trauma. We'll get a little clearer understanding of what I mean by that as we carry forward. Because when I say that, I have a particular way that I intend that. So let's go ahead and dive in. Brief background about me, because I know that some people are a little more familiar with who I am and what I do. Other people, this is first encounter. It's going to be a little bizarre, but there we have it. So I'm not actually a therapist. I want to make that very clear. I am not a therapist. This session is not a therapeutic session. This is conceptual. This is for practitioners. Hopefully everybody got the memo on that one. So while I'm not a therapist, I am a current doctoral student in clinical psychology with a depth psychology focus. And basically what depth psychology is relative to clinical psychology in the whole broad world of clinical psychology, what this means is I have a particular fondness for the unconscious. Depth psychology is Freudian, Jungian, all of those cats who are into the idea of the unconscious. Rather than, as is typical in the States in particular, here in the US, the sort of rats and stats approach to psychology. We can learn a lot from that approach. We can learn a lot from population level studies. We can learn a lot from behavioral studies looking at rodents in particular. But the main thrust of depth psychology is that human experience can't be reduced to statistical models or rodent behavioral studies. So hopefully that makes sense. I actually started my career professionally as a researcher at the US Environmental Protection Agency. I was working in a microbiological lab. And so the hard sciences background is actually very near and dear to me. So as much as I might poo-poo it here and there, it's actually pretty foundational for me in terms of how I understand some of these phenomena that we're going to be exploring. However, despite the research background, despite the current interest in psychology, what I'm best known for is my work in the worlds of movement and embodiment, in particular, the natural movement world, what makes us a good human animal, and in somatic education. How is it that we sort of transcend the category of just another animal? How do we reconcile mind and body? How do we make sense of both physical and emotional phenomena in human experience? All of this to say, I'm a little bit homeless when it comes to an actual professional category. I resist the neat, tidy boxes. I'm a bit of a quack in some ways, and quite proud of being a quack in some ways. But since this is about trauma and not about me, let's get into the meat of it. Now, I'd love to know, and please, if you would, could you type this in the Q&A, since I can't see the chat. What do we mean by trauma? When we say the word trauma, what does that mean? How do we define it? How do we describe it? What sort of associations do you have as we embark on this journey when you hear the word trauma? And again, please, if you would, type that in the Q&A rather than the chat box, since I can only see one at a time without it being problematic. What does trauma mean? Maybe I can see the chat too. Oh, I can. Good. We'll keep it going. Trauma, an experience that can overwhelm our resources. I think that's a piece of the puzzle, Lisa. Yeah. Who else? I ask because I don't know. Let's pretend I'm the idiot. What do we have? Trauma is pain. Trauma is an event that has an irreversible negative impact, an unintegrated resource. The memories, body sensations from an event that happened that is now stuck. Okay, yeah. So we can see that trauma is generally a negative thing, it seems. Trauma is related to experiences we've been through. It's either a physical incident or experiential overload of the system. Yeah, nice. So we're going to think in systems here. Cool. Getting stuck in fight, flight, freeze, in a appeased state even after the danger is gone. Yes, wonderful, nice. Sensational overload, memory stored within the body. Beautiful. Cool. So I don't think I actually then have anything to say here. I think we're good. We covered it all. I don't know how I'm going to go about dismissing all of these. I think I'll skip it for the time being, but we can keep chatting the questions here too. So I ask this about trauma because I think that when we are engaging in work with an inherently nebulous phenomenon, it's very important that we know what it is we're talking about. In my own experience and in conversations with colleagues over the years, I've found that people have a difficult time understanding the territory that they're navigating when the map doesn't map onto it nicely. So the words we use to describe these things, these are in fact maps of various phenomena. These are not trauma in and of itself. These words we use to describe trauma, they point to trauma, but this really is a situation where it's like the apocryphal story of the blind man and the elephant. One person's feeling along and they feel the leg and they say, well, this is a tree. Another person's feeling along, they feel the trunk and they say, no, it's a snake. And we're all grasping at little bits of this situation without ever really comprehending the entirety of it. Now, I make no claims to have an understanding of the entirety of trauma in this presentation. What I can promise is that we will think a little bit more clearly about the phenomenon as I dismiss these questions one at a time. And hopefully it can give you a way to connect these dots a little more effectively. That, if nothing else, is one of the things that I am quite good at, is dot connecting. So as I mentioned, I ask about this trauma situation because I've only ever heard about trauma. I've caught glimpses of its shadows, or I've tracked its footprints when I'm working with clients, but frankly, I've never laid eyes on the beast. I've never seen it myself. And that, I think, is an important characteristic for us to consider if we're going to work with trauma. And in fact, I'm not even quite sure if it's a beast at all. Now, I say this, and some of you will be familiar and might have a hint of where I'm going with this. I say this because, again, the words we use to describe these phenomena are very important. They're important both for our understanding, and they do, in fact, shape the ways in which we engage with these phenomena moving forward. Now, as an example of this, I'll tell you a little story about a town named Addison. This is actually a made-up town. There's no such town. But a pair of researchers were exploring how people might make sense of complex situations based on the words used to describe those situations. So Addison is a town that has a crime problem. And these researchers, they had a set of statistical information looking at crime stats, incidence rates, types of crime. And what they did is they gave a presentation on this information to two groups of participants. And they began this presentation with the phrase, crime is a blank, ravaging the city. Now, the only difference in the presentation, they read the script. The only difference was what filled in the blank here. And the two different groups heard one of two words. In one group, they heard the phrase, crime is a beast ravaging the city. The other group heard the phrase, crime is a virus ravaging the city. One word was different in the entirety of the presentation. and yet the outcomes were wildly different. What the researchers found is that that one word at the start of all of the information that was to follow made a big impact. Again, the only difference was whether the participants heard that it is a beast or it is a virus. The groups that heard the word beast, crime is a beast ravaging the city, when they were asked, after hearing all of the statistical information, what they would do about that, 81% recommended a higher police presence as the way to deal with crime, as opposed to the groups that heard the virus variation. Only 31% recommended higher police presence. In fact, the groups that heard crime as a virus recommended social reform, dealing with systemic issues much more frequently. But those that heard beast thought of crime as a beast, thought in terms of crime and punishment, thought in terms of a thing that needed to be subdued. So they recommended a higher police presence. All of this to say that the way we speak about these complex phenomena is wildly important. It's important for us as clinicians, as practitioners, to have an understanding of this, how we might skew our own interventions. And it's really important when we're working with the public, how we deal with this as well. Sloppy language leads to a lot of misunderstandings. And the language of this is what we're going to be paying particular attention to as we make our way through this presentation. Now, I introduced this concept at the beginning because, in a strange twist of fate, what the researchers found is that when this phrase, crime is a beast or crime is a virus, when it was placed at the end of that statistical information, it didn't make any difference in how the groups chose to respond to that situation. That is to say that when the phrase is placed at the end of the stats, both groups chose roughly the same outcomes. It was hard to tell the difference between the groups. So this difference of beast or virus really only made a difference when it was used to frame the statistical information. When it was used as a period or a punctuation at the end, didn't make a difference. So the frames that we bring to these phenomena are going to be very, very important. So I hope that makes sense. Is everyone following so far? Would you give me a maybe yeah or a hooray or anything in the chat to let me know? What do we have here? Kevin raised his hand. I see a yes in the chat. Kevin, I don't know how to unraise your hand. Lay it on me. Either can you ask in the chat or type in the Q&A? That was my yay. Oh, that was your yay. Good. We're going to have a hell of a time with the Zoom webinar here, but we'll make it through. So I see a bunch of yeses. I see a bunch of yays. I see a yes. Love it. Wonderful. So this language bit, I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to words. When I was a kid, I actually carried a dictionary around with me. Like I would carry this to social engagements. My parents would drag me along. You can tell that I was an only child because I carried a dictionary around, right? So words are near and dear to me, not because they're very precious, but because they have such a profound influence on the way that we engage in the world around us. So, as I mentioned, what I would love to do with this depth psychological focus, I would really love to bring trauma partly back into the realm of human sciences rather than natural sciences. What I mean by this is that in the scientific community, there are two distinct camps. There's human science tradition, which has a very different philosophical commitment, we'll say, than does the natural science tradition. Both are valid. Both operate from very different sets of premises. Both have very different uses, and both can explore different aspects of phenomena. We might think of human sciences as having to do with the human experience as description, whereas the natural science tradition might look at these phenomena more in an explanatory model. You might also think that human sciences have to do particularly with the quality of experience and of the phenomena in question, whereas the natural science tradition looks more at quantitative measurements. Now, it's my belief that if we bring trauma work back into the human science tradition and work from the human science assumptions and presuppositions, we can actually start to work with individuals more so than ideas. The challenge of the natural science tradition, for all of its use, for all of the wonderful things that it has given us, the challenge is that it tends to reduce. That's actually the main way that the natural sciences work, is by reducing the phenomena in question, stripping away the things that don't match the hypothesis, remaining as removed and objective as possible. Objectivity is, it's the gift and the burden of natural sciences. Now we can see that when working with trauma, that step removed quality, that objectivity, that can create a bit of a problematic thing if we're working with individuals, yeah? Individuals, at least in my experience, they don't like when you step away from them in engaging with them. They don't like when you remove and objectify and reduce their experience. At least no one I've met particularly likes being reduced to boxes and data points. Now, that's not to say that we ignore what the natural science tradition teaches us about trauma in terms of interpersonal neurobiology, in terms of hormonal changes, in terms of all of this quantified information. We can make a lot of headway, but it never grants us the entirety of the picture. So, when we're working within the human sciences, we're working with a distinct change in focus. The human sciences concern themselves with form, with pattern, with relationship, rather than the natural sciences focus on substance, on material, and on cause. So when I say that nobody has trauma, what I mean by that is that when we use the word have or contain, or I'm holding on to this, or something needs to be released, that starts to skew our thinking into the world of substance and material, cause and effect as linear, predictable processes. But of course, anyone who's worked with or experienced trauma knows that it is far from predictable. It is far from linear. And I think, it's my contention at least, I think we would be better served working with trauma, thinking of it in terms of form rather than substance, looking at it as a type of relationship rather than a type of material. Because again, as many of you will have heard me say at some point or another, we never find trauma in a cadaver study or in a microscopy panel. We never see trauma anywhere. We see consequences of it. We see the shadows of it. We see reflections of it. But trauma in and of itself has no substance. It has no dimensionality. It's utterly immaterial. That does not mean it is insignificant. Now, as many of you mentioned in the beginning part, trauma as a pattern of relationship, trauma as a form, is characterized by a certain rigidity. It's a stuckness, right? It's characterized in large part by a discontinuity of experience. It is a rip in the fabric of one's being. And if we think of it in terms of a relationship, it is an interruption of normal relating, right? It's a way of moving through the world in which the world cannot disclose itself as a place of opportunity. The world discloses itself as a place of challenge, of threat, right? So if we think phenomenologically, big mouthful, we move through the world and perceive sets of constraints, things that impede us in the world, and affordances, things that are available, things we could make use of within the world. We perceive the world this way. And trauma is that situation in which my perception is narrowed and frozen, as many of you mentioned before. Now, when we think of it this way, this automatically forces us to consider that the unit of change isn't just the individual. what we're looking at when we're dealing with trauma necessarily is the individual plus the environment around it. Relationships take two, right? There have to be two parties involved. So if we're going to look at form and pattern and relationship, we must keep in mind that let's say the Western compulsion toward an atomized, reduced individual necessarily falls short. It has a pretty short runway in terms of where that can take us. Asking someone merely to change themselves radically, it's a challenging proposition. Now, we'll circle back to that idea, but hopefully that makes sense so far, that when we're looking at trauma, we're looking at organism plus environment. We're looking at patterns of relationship. And the early biologists, cyberneticists, linguists, another sort of renegade character who never really fit into any neat molds, Gregory Bateson, said beautifully, "You cannot study one half of a relationship and make sense. What you will make is disaster." Bateson had a bit of a broken mind. Like the way that his brain worked, it was bizarre, but he was spot on in this regard. If you study relationship and only look at one half of it, you will automatically lead to disaster. We don't know when. We can't predict when, but it is a pretty short runway. You might look at the ongoing climate crisis as an example of this. If we look at organism without seeing it as intricately, irreducibly linked to the environment around it, if we look at the unit of survival as anything other than organism and environment, we're in for a really rough situation. It does not make sense to think of organisms outside of the context of their environment, because an organism can't make meaning outside of the context of its environment. So again, what we're going to be exploring here are patterns of interactions, of relationships. I hope that all makes sense so far too. What I'd like to offer here is that trauma is a psychopathology. If nothing else, I think we can agree that trauma is a psychopathology. It is a disordered way of relating to the world. But I don't mean this in a particularly clinical sense. I don't mean this in a diagnostic sense. What I mean when I say psychopathology is something much more human. When we look at the roots of the word psychopathology, there are three words. There's psyche, there's pathos, and there's logos. Psyche is something like the soul. It's that numinous quality of human experience. Pathos generally means suffering or pain. And logos is speech or word or meaning. Yeah. So etymologically, when we look at trauma as psychopathology, what we're looking at is the speech of the suffering soul. So maybe take a moment and sit with that. If we consider trauma to be the speech of the suffering soul, all of the symptoms, all of the bizarre characteristics that we see when we're looking at this category we might call traumatized, if we consider this not as a symptom to be fixed, if we look at this person as someone who is in the grip of the speech of the suffering soul, does that change something about the way that you think of this? Does that change something about the emotional tone? Does it change something about how you might go about working with that phenomenon? What comes to mind for you? I'm curious for folks. When you hear this phrase, speech of the suffering soul, whether in the chat or in the Q&A, what does that evoke for you? I'd love to know. I find for many people when they hear that it's a very different way of relating to it. Compassion, yeah. Is there anything else? Allowing expression. Nice. We can work with that. Maybe it doesn't actually mean much to folks. But I think this idea of compassion, call for empathy, relatability, beautiful. Yeah, allowing expression. This, I think, orients us away from the realm of fixing. Yeah. When we think of this as, and really when we're looking at psychological phenomena, we're looking at soul, not merely mind. That's one of the challenges of most English translations of the early psychoanalytic research, is that it's reduced to mind. When what Freud was writing about in particular, he was using the same word as Jung, Seele, Siele. Jung's translators translated it as spirit. Freud's translated it as mind. Um, we can wonder about our different interpretations of those fellows based on that. Beautiful, yeah. Poetic phrase, which includes soul, not often included in the topic. Yeah. Whether I understand the language of the speech for that person. Yes. I think everyone is bringing a lot of good stuff into this. When we're looking at the speech of the suffering soul, we're entering into a conversation, the rules and the terms of which we may not understand. As clinicians, as practitioners, we are very quick to rummage through our toolbox, to look through our set of concepts to try and fit this person into. And it's well-meaning, right? It's a well-meaning thing to look for the tools to help alleviate this suffering. Most of us in this work, we're feeling-oriented people. We like people. We don't like to see people suffer. Whenever possible, we want to alleviate that suffering. However, those of us drawn to this work also have a challenging situation in which we tend to fit the wounded healer model. And often, not always, often we have this secret compulsive need to demonstrate our use. We want to be of use. We want to prove the worth of our work. So we go about fixing and tinkering and trying to do all of this rather than simply being with. And as Jennifer mentioned here, allowing people to be where they are. When we're engaged in speech, in discourse, in relationship, it's easy to fall into the trap of doing a lot of stuff. But in the realm of the suffering soul, I think the doing maybe loses some of its utility. So, to Albert's point earlier, allowing expression, we know from this orientation, I should say this isn't the only way to consider it, obviously, but I think it's a very useful way. We know in this speech that something is being communicated. But what? That's the mystery of this. What is being communicated through the symptoms of the person? The psychoanalytic tradition, for all of the problematic and confusing elements of it, one of the biggest resources it grants us is the idea that symptoms are the return of the repressed. This is where the material from which we've turned away makes itself known through these oblique little messages, through the roundabouts, through the slips, through the speech of the suffering soul. So our question here will be, what is being communicated and how is it being communicated? The human science traditions concern themselves primarily with what and how, with description rather than explanation. The natural science inclination would be for us to look to why. What happened? What's the root cause? Oof. That phrase, I think, is problematic in human endeavors. As if we could reduce something as complex as trauma to one cause. I think that's wishful thinking. There will inevitably be a number of different factors involved here. So we're going to look more at the what and the how rather than the why in this situation. Now, we might think that communication at the base level of it, it's the sharing of information. Again, the root of the word communicate means to share. It's a sharing with. And I would extend that what's being shared in communication is information primarily. Now, there are two types of information, and it's useful for us to have a sense of this when we're working with the speech of the suffering soul. Things might be shared two ways. There's what's known as digital information, and this is very specific. This is binary. Digital is, you can think of the words that we use, the actual speech uttered. That's primarily digital communication. It's this and that. The phenomenon fits into the category of this word, or it fits into the category of that word. It is good, it is bad. Yes, no. Black, white. Useful in many ways, but incomplete. The other type of information, and it's important for us to have a handle on this as well, is analogous information. Analogous information speaks to patterns of relationship. Again, whereas digital information, it's abstracted. You can think of it as it's pulled up away from the phenomenon in question. It's talking about. Analogous information speaks to the pattern of relationship. So when I say think kittens here, you can think of words for digital, think kittens for analogous. Kittens don't have the gift of speech. They're not the most eloquent speakers, yeah? What they are masters of is communicating patterns of relationship. So the kitten that rubs against your leg and mews at you and looks up at you with its cute little eyes, or horrible little eyes if you hate cats, who knows? Everyone differs. But what they're doing when they're rubbing up against you and mewing, they're not speaking words. They lack the specificity of a request, right? Digital communication is specific. It says, I want a glass of water. I want a saucer of milk. What the kittens are doing is communicating something like dependency. They're rubbing against, they're mewing, they're pawing at. They're speaking to a pattern of relationship that they had with the mother who nursed them. The rubbing against, the pawing, the mewing all communicates this general pattern of dependency. It's up to us, or you, I don't have a cat, but up to cat owners to interpret that vague sort of request, to specify it and say, do you want a saucer of milk? Is that what you want? Do you want to be pet? And that communication continues on until you get it right. People who have infants know the same thing. Infants have not yet mastered digital transmission of information. They can't make the specific request yet that says, I need my diaper changed, or I'm hungry, or I'm cold, or I'm existentially terrified as I learn myself and other, and that I'm finite within this vast universe, right? They don't have the words to put to those experiences. What they are good at is analogous screaming. Yeah. And the parents, potentially very frazzled parents, have a hell of a time deducing the specific thing that is being communicated. Oh my God, is your diaper dirty? No. Okay, it's not that. Do you need food? No. Oh my God, do you just need to be rocked and held? No. Oh geez, I don't know. So this back and forth between analogous and digital information causes us a lot of trouble, because something is always lost in the translation, right? The important thing to consider is that as a clinician, as a practitioner, when you are working with someone who has gone through this experience that we might call trauma, you need to be on the lookout for these two sorts of information. There is what is said about their experience, the words they use, the turns of phrase, the expressions, and then there's everything else that isn't explicitly stated. There's all of this stuff that isn't given speech, all of this communicated in the roll of the eye, the shrug of the shoulder, the bracing, the inhibition of breath, right? These all speak to patterns of relationship. as much as the digital information speaks to the specificity of their experience. The words they use have specific meanings, but we can't assume the specific meanings of those words. Again, if we're entering into the speech of the suffering soul, this is playing by a set of rules that we don't know. We're entering into a subjective universe. And we have to help our clients map out that universe with as few assumptions as possible. We can treat each individual as fresh. That doesn't mean to throw out what we generally know about trauma. It doesn't mean to forget everything we've ever learned. What it does mean, and this again is one of the commitments of a human science tradition, it's allowing that person to be their own model of reality, rather than wedging them into our models of reality, our models of understanding. What it means is, and I think Jacob mentioned this earlier, it's listening with a sense of receptivity, looking for relatability, looking for their interpretation of their experience. So I hope that makes sense so far. When we get into communication, information theory, it can be a little heady at times, but I hope that all makes sense. I find it's helpful to know, though, if we are concerning ourselves with speech of the suffering soul, the ways in which that speech is communicated. Now, speech is about meaning making. We wouldn't communicate if not to get a meaning across. And of course, you know as well as I do that speech is open to interpretation, that the impact your speech has on me can be very different than your intent. I might make a different meaning out of that than you intended. Now, communication as a phenomenon is meaningful in two ways. And this, I think, is important for us to consider here. Communication is meaningful in two ways. First, if it's successful, communication changes the behavior of its addressee. So if I am successfully communicating with you as we go through this presentation, it's changing your behavior. Now, challenge thing in the webinar, I have very little way to know if it's changing your behavior, right? Maybe some things show up in the chat or the questions, maybe people type haha or they respond, but hopefully this is changing your behavior, having you nodding along, saying, oh yeah, giving the thoughtful stroking of the chin. Maybe you're taking down notes. That would all be successful communication. That would be meaningful in one way. However, communication is also meaningful if it fails. And if it fails, it changes the behavior of both parties in that communication. So we might think communication is successful if it changes the behavior, and that's meaningful too. If it changes the behavior of the addressee, the person I'm speaking to, communicating with. But if it fails, both parties change their behavior. Maybe in that case, that means you say, forget this, I'm going to log out of this. If everybody, for example, logged out of the webinar, that would change my behavior and make me cry, make me start drinking a little early, make me start, I'm kidding, right? But it would change both of our behaviors if this communication failed. If I was unable to transmit this information to you effectively, both of us would have to change our behaviors. At the very least, I would have to take a step back and say, are you guys still with me? Is everything coming along okay? And then you might change your behavior and type in, and then we could enter into a new communicative situation. So the speech of the suffering soul, we can bet, as clinicians and practitioners, we can make a pretty safe bet that there has been an ongoing failure to communicate. Yeah. Which is why that soul who is suffering in this case, which is why they have had to change their behavior so dramatically. You might think if what wanted to be communicated through them was successful, they would have no need to change their behavior. Successful communication doesn't change the behavior of the person communicating. Their behavior only changes in case of failure. So, oh boy, I feel like this is a trite cliche line. I don't know what it's from, some stupid pop culture reference. But what we have here in the case of trauma is a failure to communicate. Yeah. Speech of suffering soul is not getting through. It is not being heard. We might think that it is, in many ways, unable to be heard quite yet. Because when we think of two parties in communication, you can have a communication with yourself as well. Yourself is another. It's a separate entity in some ways. And I don't know that we need to get into that too much yet today, but you can have a conversation with yourself. Something can be communicated through you. And if it fails to do so, behavior will change radically. But again, what we call trauma is in many ways the thing that can't be heard. Trauma as an experience, as a phenomenon, it's that which defies speech. It's that which resists symbolization. It can't be put into words. It can't be categorized. Trauma, you might think of, it's a shattering experience. When we speak, when we make use of all of these symbols, all of these words, we're categorizing our experience. The language that we're using to go through this presentation, it's inherited, right? We didn't have to make up these words. We've entered into a landscape of language when we were born. We entered into a well-defined landscape where this meant this, that meant that other thing meant that other thing. Language wants to tidy things up. Language, the spoken word in particular, wants digital precision. But trauma, it's the tide that rushes in and sweeps away all of the sand castles. It demolishes the categories. Sometimes it's even sneakier than that, right? It might not come in and demolish, but trauma is that vagrant, errant party that slips between the categories. It's the lurking in-betweenness. It's that uneasy feeling where you wonder, did I lock the door? What was that bump outside? Where's the light? It's the uneasy feeling that something has not yet been accounted for in your experience. Symbolic representation and categorization and speech, they account for things. They help us organize and order our experience. But trauma, again, is that which defies that organization. It's what doesn't want to be put into words and simultaneously is begging to be put into words, right? Again, it is the unaccounted for in the order of oneself. Question from Jennifer. I'm hearing the suffering soul isn't communicating well with the ego thing. Is this on the right track? Like the dream abstract talk, trauma is abstract space. Jennifer, the way I would think of this, which of course isn't the way you have to think of this. It's a beautiful thing about thinking. Trauma is that experience that defies our ability to talk about it. So it's actually unable to be abstracted. It's kept in the sense of concrete realness, right? See, when we can talk about a thing, when we can put it into words, we can abstract up a level away from it, which is a really good thing. Words, symbolic representation, they help us make sense of presence and absence. So if I can talk about a thing, that means I'm not enmeshed in the thing, for better or for worse, right? You might think as a related example, on the more positive side, if you are having sex and you're saying out loud to yourself, I'm having really great sex right now, you're probably not, right? Because you've abstracted and removed yourself from the experience. Really great sex, you don't have words for it. That shit is real, right? It defies speech. Trauma is a more negative example of it, right? Good sex, we could say, is a good thing. Trauma, we could say, is a bad thing. Yeah. It defies that abstraction. If we want to help a person organize and order their experience, we have to figure out how that can be communicated, how that raw, real, uncategorized, awful, unaccounted for experience can be brought into the realm of language. Does that make sense, Jennifer? Lots of nodding. Okay, cool. My pleasure. I try to be clear with it. If I'm not clear as we go through this, if there are questions, please let me know. Helps me flesh it out a bit more as well. So what we're looking to do is figure out what within that raw mess, that disordered, that primordial chaos of experience, what is it that is begging to be and simultaneously defying the articulation through speech? Because it is through speech. This is where I think we particularly in the embodiment community, in the movement community, we run into a lot of trouble because we neglect the profound significance of language and symbolic representation for our human experience. The only way that I can organize my experience, I shouldn't say the only way that I can have a reasonable shot at having a good time in life is by being able to articulate and organize my experience in language. The people who have a difficult time with this tend to have a pretty bad time, right? They're characterized by a sense of boundarylessness, where things don't mean things and they're just swimming through experience. That's not fun. That's overwhelming. Yeah. Psychosis is a really clear example of that, of someone who has not entered into the world of language, is unable to abstract away from their experience. So hopefully that makes sense. So trauma is that which defies speech, symbolization, and categorization. This is important because we know when meaning making that meaning is always made by the last word in a something, right? In a sentence. A sentence means something only at the last word. The last word is what recontextualizes everything that came before it linguistically. If I'm talking about my friend and I'm telling you, man, he is such a piece of shit. Is he a piece of art? Is he a thing of beauty? The last word redefines everything that came before it. You can think when you're watching a really good movie, like a psychological thriller, and you're going through it and you're tense and there's all this stuff happening, and then something happens at the end and you say, holy shit, I want to rewatch that entire thing because, oh my God, it all makes sense now. That thing happened and that meant that, and oh my gosh, he was doing that, but he was on their side all the time. We can all think of our favorite shows, that the dramatic, psychological, really stirring ones where something happens and we look back at everything that came before in the story, and it's all flavored a little differently now. It all means something different because of the last link in the signifying chain. This is a concept from the work of a psychoanalyst named Jacques Lacan. The last word, or the last link in the signifying chain, the last event in a series of events, recontextualizes everything that came before. This is where time breaks down a bit. The human sciences love this. The natural sciences hate this. How can something that happened afterwards cause a thing that came before? The natural scientists shake their fists at the heavens. The natural sciences want linear sequences of cause and effect. Trauma doesn't work that way. Human sciences don't work that way. Many people have had the experience after the fact of realizing that they had been traumatized, right? Many people who grow up in abusive situations or grow up in, let's say, cults or grow up in any number of problematic environments, they don't recognize how problematic it is until something happens after they are removed from that situation. People in abusive relationships, romantic relationships, or work relationships, social ones, they have the same situation. They don't realize how fucked up the thing was until they were removed from it, until someone said to them, that didn't seem right. Like what you went through, that was bad. That was trauma, I think. Then their world begins to break open a bit, right? They're left having to recontextualize the entirety of their experience. So what we're dealing with here is a different relationship to time, one that doesn't follow a straight line sequence. Because we know when we're dealing with meaning making and trauma as communication, as speech of the suffering soul, it's concerned primarily with meaning. Meaning is the stuff of human experience, in the human science tradition at least. So when we're dealing with meaning, we have to pay attention to whatever comes next in the sequence. The next thing is always the most important thing because it's what defines the context of that sentence, of that story, of that person's life. The challenge is that trauma insists on bringing the past into the future. As we talked about before, it's a freeze within a certain state. It's a stuckness. It's a repetition. We're all familiar, at least colloquially, with the idea of repetition compulsion, where I keep finding myself in the same situation over and over and over again. It's like I haven't gotten the punchline. I didn't learn the lesson. I haven't been able to communicate and hear and understand that which is begging to be communicated. So this is the idea that I'd like to put forth here, is that the reason in traumatized individuals, we'll say, the reason why they're so prone to repeating these situations is that the past is being brought into the future in almost an entelechic, I'll explain that in a moment, an entelechic begging for resolution, we'll say. Now, entelechy is this concept that the event has the resolution kind of baked into it somehow, that the future is kind of wrapped up within the potentiality of the thing. It's a strange, heady sort of concept, but I think when we're dealing with trauma and the nebulous back and forth circuitous relationship of time, I think that's a really important thing for us to consider. A person may be enacting these behaviors and attitudes and perceptions, and we might think of it as something is being communicated through those symptoms. That person is being possessed by some entity almost. Something is it's attempted to be communicated. However, it's been unsuccessful thus far. So that person is having to change their behavior again and again and again to shrink and rigidify and narrow and condense until they get to the goddamn core of what is being communicated, until there's nothing left of them but that communication, but that thing that is begging to be articulated, right? I think this is a much more human way to look at a person's symptoms when they're gripped by trauma. Trauma reduces a person to just the raw core of that communication until that person is nothing left but what is begging to be communicated. And they stay that way until the thing is heard, until the information is transmitted, until the message is received and understood and held in this communicative context. I think this is so important for us to at least have this idea in the back of our heads when we're working with individuals who have been affected by trauma. I hope that makes sense so far too. We can unpack it more if need be. So the challenge, again, is that trauma insists on bringing the past into the future. It enacts the past at the expense of the future. That person's potentials are so shrunken down until repetition of that situation is the only possibility. So we can look at two temporal relationships here. And I hope this isn't getting too heady, too far afield. You'll see that this necessarily anchors back into the body. But I think having the zoom up and the zoom down is a useful thing for us. So we might consider two temporal relationships. One is the old Freudian dictate that where it was, that's supposed to say it, not is, where it was, or where it ruled, I must be, or I must become. Freud in the original German wrote this. This is the core of psychoanalysis. This is the core of effective therapy, truly is. It's a reclamation of agency within a person's experience. So where it was, it being the unconscious, it being that thing that had rule over me, to which I was subject, I must be, I must become, I must come into being. That's one way we might consider this. The other is another idea of Lacan's playing with time rather than I am all that I was, I am the product of my upbringing, I am forever screwed because of this that happened. We might think of it in the future perfect. I am what I will have been. I don't think this is merely mincing words. I could be wrong. This could just be cute wordplay, but I think there's something pretty significant in this. If we want to interrupt the tendency, the pernicious tendency of trauma to drag the past forward into the future, we must recontextualize our relationship with our past. Where it ruled, that event, that person, that thing, I must come into being. And I must come into being not as a product of the past, but as a future potential. I am what I will have been. I think what this turn of phrase does for us, the way that I interpret this at least, it places us a step removed from the rawness of our experience. Let's say I'm in the grip of anxiety and panic and fight, flight, and all of this. I'm gripped by my experience. It's easy for me to reduce myself and say, well, this is what I am, and this is what I've been, and this is how it's always going to be. This is what I am forever. To create a sense of finality with myself. And I don't think that's very helpful for us. I find it incredibly defeating when I speak that way. If I say, oh, God, I messed this up. I've always messed that up. I'm going to just forever mess this up. That's a little problematic. It confines my perception to the constraints on my being. But there are always affordances within a person's being as well. And if I begin to think of what I am as what I will have been at some later date, again, if you think of the links on the chain, recontextualizing what came before, that thing that I will have been, that recontextualizes what I am now, just as what I am now recontextualizes what I have been historically, where it was I come into being as what I will have been even further down the road. This turn of phrase, I think, implies an orientation toward the future. It makes room for a future, when in a traumatized individual's life, there's only room for the past. So, I hope that's not mere wordplay. It strikes me as very significant. Working with trauma inherently is a working with a person's definition of self across time, both in body and in speech. The way they talk about themselves, the way they carry themselves, the behaviors they enact day to day. All of this makes up a sense of self. A sense of self, a person's self-image, we can think of it as something like the sensory motor information that they're getting, all of the little signals within themselves, the proprioceptive signals, the feelings, all of that, as organized within the realm of language. Again, the raw embodied experience is contained within the realm of language. And that's partly what goes into self-image. It's all of my sensory motor information coupled with and confined by my narrative experience, the story of who I am and what sort of person I am in the world. So when we're working with individuals who've been affected by trauma, we're working to help them redefine their sense of self, because their sense of self has been dramatically redefined for them by that event or that series of events. Their sense of self has been cut off from itself. So what we're looking to do is expand the sense of self, to restore a sense of optionality within the sense of self, to bring them back to the place where they have agency, they have a sense of sovereignty in their experience, where they have a choice in where the narrative goes from here. That to me is the successful resolution of trauma. It's not that everything's hunky-dory. It's not that everything is peachy keen. It's that they have a choice where no choice existed before. That, I think, is the restoration of human dignity. That is what we can orient our interventions toward as clinicians and practitioners. The question, I think, is, can I be informed by my past? That is, the past gives me shape. It gives me form. I can't deny the past, right? That would be silly. That would be not what we're talking about here. But can I be shaped and brought into being by the past without being inhibited by the thing? That is, dwelled within, the root of inhibit, or pardon, I mix those up, inhibit and inhabit. Inhabited is dwelled within. Inhibited is held in. So I have a relationship with my past. Again, we're talking about form and patterns of relationships. Can I be informed by everything I've been through without everything I've been through still dwelling within me and holding me in? What we're looking to do is redefine and recontextualize a relationship with my past, right? What we're looking to do is add a new link to that chain of events that makes a different sense of meaning out of everything that's come before. Can I be informed without being inhibited or inhabited by the past? As I mentioned, our therapeutic aim here in working with trauma is the restoration of options, of dexterity, of agency, even of ambiguity. And I mean that because when we are in a rigid perception, everything means a certain thing, right? It is black and white. There is no shade of gray there. Moshe Feldenkrais, an early somatic educator, had this idea that compulsion is having one way to do a thing. A primitive choice is having two ways to do a thing. This or that, yes or no, black or white. But human dignity, he said, begins at having three ways to do a thing. It's yes, no, maybe, or this, that, and the other. It's the room in between the fixity of the precision that people define themselves by. It's making room for mystery in a person's experience. You might think that a person who's been affected by trauma has a deficit of mystery in their experience. Everything is known, and everything is known as a threat, right? So we want to bring a person back to a sense of optionality, of dexterity, of agency, of ambiguity, restore them to a more nuanced experience of themselves in relationship to the world around them, because the world is characterized and defined by relationships. Everything is by virtue of relationships. So how do we do that? How do we begin to move forward? I say begin because, of course, in the time we have today, that we can talk about some ideas. We can make some inroads into this thing, but you know as well as I do that this is an ongoing process, as it will be for our clients too. So how do we begin to move forward? What I would think is that we can claim responsibility in two ways. Responsibility can be that sense of ownership and agency. It can hearken us back to Freud's idea of where it was or where it ruled. I must be, I must become, I must come into being. I can claim a sense of responsibility over my experience. Now, I need to take a moment to clarify. This is not the same as what's known as victim blaming. This is not holding the person at fault for what happened to them. This is offering them a sense of agency over what comes next. This is saying that as links are being added onto that signifying chain, they have a say in ensuring that we don't merely add more of the same onto it. So we can claim responsibility for our experience. We can turn our its into I's. We can say, all of that happened, and it sucked, and it was awful, and endlessly, and I have a say in what happens moving forward. That responsibility is a challenging thing because, as many people have talked about, particularly in our chat thus far, trauma is characterized by an overwhelm of one's internal resources, right? Where my resources, the sense of say that I feel I have within my life can be so shrunken down that I might look at that and say, what the hell are you talking about? How am I to claim responsibility for that? And as a clinician, that's where I think we would do well to resist intervening. We would do well to turn the question around and say, I don't know. How will you do that? How are you going to do that? Because we can't give a person a strategy or advice for how to live their experience and how to navigate something like this. We can offer them ways to connect to some of their internal resources. And I know a number of you from your backgrounds thus far, I know you have plenty of ways to help people resource themselves more effectively. We'll talk about a couple of other things to add to the toolkit here as well. But the primary thing is holding in mind that you don't know how this person is going to move forward. None of us do. They don't know. It is their responsibility to figure that out. If we do all of the figuring out for them, we rob them of that sense of agency. We rob them of the possibility of becoming and keep them dependent on some other to deal with that other that they've been through. It's a very challenging thing, of course. Now, the other meaning of responsibility, I say two ways. One is the claiming of agency within our experience. It's that interruption of the past in saying, I am what I will have been. The other, I mean this quite tangibly. I mean this in terms of an action. of behavior. Responsibility could be interpreted as the ability to respond. It's the ability to respond rather than merely react. Reaction is that carrying forward of the past, right? It react, we're doing the thing again. Responding has a much more fluid quality to it, right? Responding gets us back into this realm of options and dexterity. So if I'm looking to increase my ability to respond, this is where I think we anchor ourselves back into the body. This is where we actually cultivate a capable sense of being. We don't merely help a person feel better about themselves. I think that still keeps them removed from it somehow, and not in a constructive way. What I think our task is as embodied practitioners, those of us who are, I know some therapists are here as well, I think our task is to help a person develop a self-worth esteeming. Now, I know people have a challenging relationship to the word worth. For a person who is gripped and shrunken and inhabited by this, they likely don't feel that they are worth esteeming. But what we know is that we learn through embodied experience. We can develop situations where a person can learn strength, both the physical expression of strength and the metaphorical implications of that strength. We can help them regain actual capability of navigating through the environment. We can help them restore themselves to a sense of that animal vigor of which we're all capable. At the very least, we can help them not feel crushed by their experience, crushed by the pull of gravity. We can help them find a sense of support underneath of them by connecting to the ground beneath them, for example, by connecting to a sense of intrinsic support through the skeletal system. What do we have here, Albert? Help them find an environment where they can see their own virtues. Yeah, we're creating situations in which they can learn their way out of this rigidity that they have learned. If we think of trauma as speech of the suffering soul, if we think of speech as communication, as the transmission of information, they have been informed by their historical experience. We can create conditions for them to find new information in dash formation here. We can help them, again, find their own virtues, develop an embodied sense of self as capable, as manifesting possibility. And I don't mean that in the woo-woo sort of way. I mean that in a tangible, making manifest within the world sort of way. So, how do we do that? I think there are two primary ways. And this is, I think, a simple way. I hope not simplistic. But I think first, we can give them an experience of articulation. And I mean that quite literally. Each of the joints is an articulating surface, right? The traumatized individual is characterized by certain patterns of rigidity, not only in their psychological functioning, but in terms of their somatic expression as well. This is a psychosomatic situation, not in the old-timey, let's dismiss that and say it's all in your head sort of way, but involving both psyche and soma, right? Soul and the body-mind entity. So the person who has been through this experience has characteristic patterns of rigidity, has characteristic postures they take in relationship to perceived threats in the environment. So as a person, many of you are therapists or coaches, or you work with language in some sense, right? As a person is talking through their experience, this is where you can start to look for what sort of analogous communication is coming through. How do they organize themselves when they talk about the challenges of their lives? Where do they go? Do they shrink? Do they collapse? Does their left side somehow cease to exist? Do they stiffen and brace themselves? What we want to look for is where within their experience have they turned their body into some other, into some it. You'll likely hear this as clinicians in the language of, I got a bad back, I got a bad hip, it's tense, it's tight, that hurts. The it's, the that's, the thems, the distancing from body as self, that's something to be on the lookout for. Yeah. When a person's experience is made to be in the third person, you have hit the jackpot, because that's where they need to come into being. They're telling you where they need to come into being, even in talking about their symptoms. So what we can do, and I know many of you have various skill sets for working with movement in the body, and we can explore that more if need be in the time for Q&A. But what we're looking to do is help them inhabit themselves in those particular symptomatic areas. Say a person is recounting a challenging situation, or say they just walk into the studio and they're frozen in this sort of curled fetal position. We can, as clinicians, make some guesses about where they've deadened themselves, where they cease to exist within themselves as a body. We can bet they're going to have issues with back pain. We can bet there's going to be all sorts of stuff around the diaphragm, around breathing. We don't know until we ask them to move and relate to us, to tell us what they're experiencing, what they're aware of within their embodied experience. A really simple thing to do, and I say very simple because I know, again, we can get into the nitty-gritty stuff later. Ask what they're aware of as they lie on the ground or as they stand there. Ask what they're aware of. Ask where it feels tense or tight. You can deliberately use the word where it feels tense and tight, because they may hold on to that a bit more effectively. They say, well, it feels tense around my low back. It feels tight in my shoulder. This is totally frozen or locked up here. They're telling you, again, where they have ceased to exist within themselves. So our first goal when working with the body is develop an experience of articulation to wake up some of the sensory motor dialogue within the area, because that really is communication between the central nervous system and all of the other parts of the body, right? We're looking at embodied transmission of information, embodied communication. So if a person is frozen in an area, how gently can they move that? Do they notice? This is key. Do they notice an experience of this and that? Again, think back to compulsion. Compulsion is only one experience, one way of doing a thing. Can they tell the difference between when their shoulder is here and when their shoulder is here? Can they move back and forth between the two? This, that, this, that, this, that. It sounds very simple, but that discernment of difference is paramount for a person's ability to learn. If they can move with attention and with care, paying particular attention to where they notice a difference now and then, this versus before, that position versus that position, that's them learning. That's the embodied cognitive system learning an experience of articulation, reclaiming a sense of optionality. Moving forward from there, another simple thing is the articulation of experience. So I say that most of our therapeutic work comes down to these two things. It's the experience of articulation, the ability to move what does not yet move, the ability to regain control and optionality in joint positions in space, but also the articulation of experience. Yeah. what people will likely find as they begin experiencing articulation is pain. They will become very keenly attuned to that hurts, or that hurts more, or that hurts a little less. It still hurts, but that doesn't hurt at all. And what we're looking to do is help them articulate those differences for themselves. Because again, the rawness and the realness and the undifferentiatedness of experience is a big problem for us. So if we're able to put into words as best we can what we are experiencing in experiences of pain, of tension, of whatever the case may be, we're able to remove ourselves in some way, to get a little breathing room between it, not to dissociate from it, simply to not be enmeshed with it. I hope that distinction makes sense. But what we're looking at here are the two different means of communicating the speech of the suffering soul. The symptoms are the speech here. All of the complaints that our clients bring us, these are the missives of the suffering soul that is begging to be heard. And it's begging for, frankly, a new conversation to take place. A new conversation can only take place when we're able to make meaning out of these particular experiences. So by restoring some of this range of motion, by restoring words to describe our experience, we bring a person back to a very different relationship with their past and with their symptoms in the present. And quite often, these two things together, the restoration of range of motion, the experience of articulation, and the description of their embodied experience, the putting into words of what they felt, those are two different types of information. Neither is complete all on its own, but those two different types of information give us a much clearer sense of what it is that is begging to be communicated through this traumatic response. Now, I know that that is a lot of information and a lot of very heady stuff to think about for many people. So I wanted to leave some time for Q&A here as well. In fact, that will probably be the more effective thing, is having questions and answers and conversation as we talk through it, because we are, of course, talking about communication. So we may as well communicate about communication. So I'd love to know, what are we left with at this point? What sort of questions come up for you? What sort of thoughts are you thinking? You can type in the chat or the Q&A. I think if need be, oh my gosh, there's an option to allow to talk. What power I wield. Yes, Albert, a recording will be sent out. It's much later for you, so yeah, go have fun. Both looking and listening differently from now on. Cool. I'm glad to hear it, Donna. Wonderful. To the point that was brought up, recording will be sent out afterwards. I don't know how long Zoom will take to process it, but you'll have access to that. It'll live, I think, forever on the realm of the internet, as these things do. Moving forward, let me know if you have other questions about this too. I recognize it can be a bit like drinking from a fire hose in one sitting. But if there are things that we can attend to here and now, happy to help. You're like a skier that's good at skiing but can't explain it. You're like a ski instructor. I like that. Yeah, that's a good way to think of it. You're probably, by virtue of the fact that you're all here, you're probably adept at a lot of this. I do find that having the ability to make our tacit knowledge explicit really helps us figure out what to do when the tacit knowledge falls apart. So when we do tumble on our skis, in this case, it's much easier then to understand how we can get back up and avoid tumbling in the future. If there aren't specific questions, I do want to say I appreciate everybody being here so far. It's been a lot of fun. Kevin, I see a hand raised. Let's allow you to talk.
Hey there. Can you hear me?
Oh, give me just a second. My audio is coming through the wrong thing. All right, Kevin.
Hey. Yeah, so it sounds like at the end there, you were drawing this correlation between helping people learn to bring more awareness to their experience of subtle movement. In effect, teaches them to understand their experience of more complex sensations within their body and also articulate them at the same time.
I think that's right. Yeah. We can keep in mind that all of our language, it's built in large part on an embodied foundation. That at some point in our history, all of the analogous communication that was used, the gestures, the gesticulation, the movement of the body that spoke to general form, it was given specificity and precision through language. And well, embodiment is one of the human existentials. We might put a bow on it that way. We learn as a body, we learn through the body. And by experiencing the nuances of one's being in a tangible, embodied sense, I think there is a strong relationship to experiences of nuance in one's psychological being as well. But I think you put that much more succinctly than I did, Kevin. What else do we have here in terms of questions? 100% to something. Pages of notes, trauma is a wave, liking the thought that for some it's a tsunami, others a tide change, but for both, if they can't swim, then they need to find ground. Totally. Yeah. The getting on solid groundness is paramount. We've got to get people on solid ground before we lecture them about the intricacies of the backstroke, right? Then we can teach them to swim. So, yeah, I like it, Donna. What else do we have here? Do you find that certain types of trauma or emotions tend to be stored, represented in specific areas of the body? That is a good question, Nathan. I do, but I would be remiss if I said that this was an outside-in sort of map. What I mean by that is, well, let's go through an example here. Simple example, but when we turn the its into I's within our body experience, capital I's, not these I's. When we turn our its into I's, a common practice that I'll work through with clients is, I just call it body talk. It comes out of the Gestalt work that I think maybe Jennifer was mentioning earlier. So if a person describes their embodied experience as, well, what do you notice? It's tense in my shoulder, or my back hurts, or all of this. We can begin a process of a little bit of wordplay. We might say, okay, so your low back hurts. What's it like to say, for example, I hurt? Is that any different? And they might verbalize that. They might speak that and say, I hurt, or I'm hurting. Well, yeah, obviously. It's like, okay, all right, obviously. Not so obvious, but just want to check. So then what kind of hurting is that? Can we qualify that somehow? And this is where we can weave in little bits of nuance by introducing possible synonyms. What kind of hurting is it? Are you aching? Are you being crushed? How would you articulate that? Or in terms of tension, is this a bracing? Is it a constricting? Is it a gripping? Is it a clutching? What sort of tension are you doing here? So many people will find that their tense throat, for example, or their tense shoulder is something like I'm choking or I'm bracing. Well, bracing against what? We can extract out a whole narrative here. Bracing implies a what? What are you bracing against? And they may flood at that point. I find very often, not all the time, but very often, when a person goes through this process of turning, say, the it into an I and making the nouns present participles or gerunds, basically the ing words, if they go from my shoulder is tense to I'm clutching, there tends to be an emotional upwelling associated with that. They'll fill in the blanks. So I do find that, generally speaking, throat and jaw stuff, you may have heard me talk about the fifth limb in certain settings. I think of that as the throat, the mouth, the jaw. That tends to be around boundaries and communication. There is sort of an embodied shorthand that arms are for contact, reaching, gripping, crushing, tearing, all of that. Legs are about support, about motility, about navigation. Spine, I think, tends to be around self-image, the way that we see ourselves in the world. But I say that those are they're only approximations. They're pretty rough maps. Sometimes people will flesh those out quite a bit if we seed those as possible interpretations. But we do want to be careful that a person doesn't then just glom onto that and say, well, the right side, it's masculine. It's all my dad. It's like, well, maybe, yes and no. Or the left side, it's feminine. It's all my mom. Sort of. So Nathan, there are, I think, some general patterns to this, but we just want to be careful that we're not, or that the client doesn't glom onto those patterns a bit too much. Hope that makes sense. What else do we have here? Make sure in the chat you've selected to all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, only Chandler can see the message. Oh, yeah. That's a good call. I see another hand raised. Oh, Lisa, let's allow you to talk.
Hello, and thank you for that. My brain is still very much processing, so my wording on this question isn't going to be as succinct or specific, and I'll give you the flavor of it. Mm-hmm. So my questions around sort of the practicalities in sessions say that a person may only have the quote unquote capacity, that feels like the wrong word, to follow their internal experience, kind of to follow that subtle movement before they kind of bounce back into the head and they want to make sense of it, or they want to find a tool for it. And so essentially, how to continue that conversation when they may not have the meaning of its importance of staying with that embodied experience.
Mm-hmm. Let's see if I'm understanding this the right way too. And we can have a little back and forth with it here.
Sure.
So I would think that a person, I'm probably one of those people where my tendency as a general response to a lot of things would be, let's zoom up to the head. Intellectualize, think about it, all of that. That is, for that person in question, it's an incredible asset. It's a real strength that they've developed that maybe they didn't know was a strength necessarily. The person who thinks, well, I can't do this. It's like, well, maybe in their perception, they can't notice the body yet. I would work with what they can do as much as possible. It's like, well, you're really good at thinking about this stuff. What is it that you do when you think about this? How do you go about thinking, helping them figure out the what and the how of what's taking place as they think about it? And even if they're thinking about it, they think about it in an embodied way somehow. Even that little thing that I just did of they do this, you might help clue that person into what they do when they think. Because when they're thinking, that person in that case is probably a bit more at ease in the thought process. So if you can use that ease as a bridge into their embodied experience, I'll often work with clients who, each of us has our particular patterns of these things, right? But I'll say, well, do you notice that when you're talking about this stuff, your head kind of turns to this side? Or I won't even tell them which side. I might say, well, when you're talking about this, where does your head go? Or where do your eyes go? Or that thing you're doing with your left hand, what are you doing with your left hand if they're, doing this as they think? But I'll meet them where they have the strength, which maybe is up in the heady intellectualizing. And I'll see if I can link that into the thing that I'm hoping to steer them towards. The person who tends to zip out of embodied experience, again, there's a skittishness, right? That's an adaptive response in some way. So we've got to meet them where they feel safe, where they feel secure, where they feel comfortable, and gradually use that as a base camp almost. It's like, all right, you want to think about this and talk about this? We'll think about this and talk about this. But we're going to think and talk our way into embodied experience here. Is that what you were getting at, Lisa? Does that make sense?
That answers one aspect of it very, very well. And I think my unarticulated question was slightly different, but that actually answers my articulated question very well.
Okay. What's the unarticulated question?
If there's no others coming through, then I was like, I'll ask the second part now that I'm a little clearer on it.
Sure.
When someone is in a state where they're unable to continue tracking, but they basically, just to name it simply, they're just so stressed out that they can't even see like the forest for the trees, or however that saying goes. It's like, I'm thinking back to a client session recently where looking for the resources in her life, it was it was kind of like the walls were closing in around her, not her words, mine. Everywhere was like, nope, nothing there, nothing there, nothing there. So that type of experience and trying to come back to the body with her was helpful in navigating, but it felt like, when someone is so stressed and not seeing any options, I love that you brought in the layering around bringing in more options for people. But when they're really not seeing them, to kind of trail some breadcrumbs. How do you trail breadcrumbs for them?
Mm-hmm. I worked with a client once who was almost, again, my words, not his, almost cartoonishly numb to physical sensation, like absurdly so, to the point where I had a hunch he was being deliberately kind of provocative at times. No, I don't feel that. I don't feel that. We had a sort of fun contention going between us. But to help him develop some sense of discernment in options of this and that, at the very least, I said, okay, would you press your hand? And he brought his right hand on his left and began pressing. And like, all right, press a little harder. Okay. Does that feel any different? No. Okay. Can you press even harder? Yeah. Does that feel any different? No. Which I have to wonder, well, how do you know it's harder in that case? But it's maybe beside the point. I said, okay. Would you raise your hand way up overhead and slap down on your left hand? He said, no, why would I do that? I was like, well, why wouldn't you? If none of this feels different, if there isn't a difference between that and that, Why not slap your hand? So in his case, the difference really was between that hurts and then it doesn't hurt. That was the only difference we had to work with. No sensations of pleasure, not even really a gradation in terms of that doesn't hurt. So in his case, I had to get a little creative because I didn't want the guy to just continually be hurting himself, but we had to get really coarse resolution in terms of the map of the body. Like zoom way out until it was, okay, if I do more, that's going to hurt, but I can sort of flirt on the boundary of that hurts and that doesn't. Gradually, we could get back into some more nuance of, does that feel good even? Like what? But to your point, because that was a bit of a circuitous story, I think. When a person is unable to differentiate options and identify resources within their environment, I will often invert the question and ask why they're not worse off. We'll zoom right in and say, you might be right. Maybe the situation is half fucked. Why is it not wholly fucked? Like, why aren't things worse for you? That too, though, can be tricky. Some people, it's like, well, it's just terrible. I know it's terrible. I understand that. Why isn't it more terrible? We are very sensitive to negative stimuli and loss aversion. We're really keen to all of the badness. The good stuff can be really difficult to tell, but between bad and worse, most people have a much easier time telling the difference between bad and worse than good and better, I find. The other thing may be that if a person is really unable to, like if they're having that big ab reaction, I think it can actually be problematic at times to focus on body awareness. And I'll often then look at situational awareness, gross motor tasks, like pick this thing up, put that there. Like if they can differentiate between where a big heavy weight is in the room, it's like, okay, this 25-pound weight, it's over here. Can it go over there? Yeah, okay, it's over there. Where's the weight now? Well, it's there, duh. And it sounds a little simplistic at times. We want to be careful about the tone of our voice so that it doesn't sound condescending in those situations. But we really do want to help a person develop at some level, at least, the capacity to discern, oh, that. Or, well, I could think of ongoing hypothetical examples, I'm sure. But is that getting closer to what you were talking about, Lisa?
Yeah, that's bringing in some other layers for sure. So, and I also get it could go on and on and on, but that's really helpful as a start. So thank you so much.
Of course, my pleasure. Yeah. Is there anything else that people have or want to bring in? I see no questions. I see no chat. I see no hands. So, in that case, one of the question, not for me, pun and digest. Cool. In that case, again, the recording will go out here, should be later today. It may actually come through automatically. I think most people got the kind of automatic Zoom webinar reminders and things. I think the recording will be sent out automatically. If you don't get it within 24 hours, please let me know, send me an email. With that said, I would love to hear if questions come up from this after the fact as well. Many of you know that there is a movement as metaphor teacher training that I'm leading over the course of the next year. We've got a couple people in here actually who are going to be a part of it. So if you'd like some information about that in terms of ongoing understanding of how to work with trauma phenomenon and applying this funky dot connecting approach to other psychological and somatic challenges, send me an email. Happy to send you the little info sheet about it. We've got a few spaces left. So outside of that, I want to say once again, thank you. It really does take, me being here, but you being here, or else I'd be talking to an empty room. And that is not so fun. So I appreciate each of you, your time, your attention, your willingness to be in front of a computer screen for more time than is biologically necessary. So with that, take care, everybody. We'll talk soon.